Hey, this is former Blue Devil lineman Matt Skura. You're listening to Basketball Conference, the ACC football podcast. Go Duke, go ACC.
Welcome back in Basketball Conference, the ACC football podcast, recording here on August 14th. It's time to preview the 2024 NC State Wolfpack with a new guest, James Henderson, Inside Pack Sports. First of all, James, welcome to the show. Appreciate you joining. I sent you a message, I think, last week, and you were very eager to come on, so I really appreciate that. How's it going?
Good, Michael, man. I appreciate it. Anytime, just reach out.
Well, here we go. 2024 NC State Wolfpack, this team's got a lot of expectations. This is a year where I feel like Dave Doran, he's continued to build a really strong program at NC State, and this isn't the first time they've entered the year with expectations. They've had them before, but I feel like this offseason, the media has really latched on to NC State as one of the handful of dark horse candidates to potentially contend for an ACC title. So what's your overall quick assessment of that and how the media views NC State and how you feel the team looks entering the new season?
Well, I think for me, it's probably a product of just consistently feeling like you're knocking at the door, right? I mean, if you look at the last 4 or 5 years in the ACC, NC State's been in the top 2, top 3, 4, top 5 in terms of programs in the league, and so they haven't been able to get through and finish one. They've been right there. And I think when you look at the way they reloaded and some of the pieces they're bringing back, it makes some sense for them to be in that top 4 group, which is kind of where I have them. You can put them in whatever order you want to put them in. But I think generally they've been in that top 4 in the league kind of going into the year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty accurate. They've won 8 games or more in 4 out of the last 5 seasons. I mean, they had that one aberration. I call it an aberration in 2019 because that team really we hadn't seen a Dave Doran program really fall off like that. I mean, he had to rebuild initially at the beginning of his tenure, but we hadn't really seen a team fall off like that. And since then, this team's been really, really consistent as a program in the ACC. Quarterback position is really interesting to me because bringing in Grayson McCall, he's a guy at Coastal under Jamie Chadwell with that really interesting offense they ran. Put up some really good numbers, but he's also been really banged up, and we saw last year it was kind of up and down. He was hurt, and I think we're going to figure out pretty quickly if McCall, who's obviously been around the block, veteran quarterback, a lot of starts under his belt, whether he was a product of the Jamie Chadwell offensive system or if he's actually just a really good college football quarterback, right? And I think we're going to figure that out pretty quickly. That's one of the big questions, I think, kind of surrounding his fit with NC State. So, I mean, how do you think he fits in to this offense that they're going to run this year? And what do you think of McCall just as a player coming in?
In all honesty, there's been zero negativity I've heard around Grayson McCall during fall camp. And that's a little different than last year with Brendan Armstrong, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. For sure.
Last year during fall camp, there was this, the offense isn't where you think it would be. And I think a lot of people last year kind of assumed it would be quick because you had Armstrong linking back up with Anai and all of those things.
Right.
I think when you break down Grayson McCall's tape, like even I don't know what his statistics were last year. You may have him at Coastal. They weren't great. But PFF had him graded, I think, 79 overall, which would have been 4th in the ACC last year among all ACC quarterbacks, just on how he played.
Right.
So, obviously you separate the way he played versus the offense and his numbers. I think that's what appeals to NC State. There's a lot there with him from a processing standpoint and an accuracy standpoint that they feel like is going to allow them to open up their offense in a major way. I think NC State believes Grayson McCall is in a position to have a monster season. I think they feel that way. And you're talking about a guy who, it's funny, I was seeing some of the ACC quarterback rankings. I saw one recently that had him 5th in the ACC behind guys like Kyron Drones and Haynes King. And I mean, I don't mean any disrespect to those players, but we're talking about a guy who was 3-time conference player of the year, albeit in the Sun Belt, but 3-time conference player of the year, has started almost 50 games, all these different things. And you're putting him behind Haynes King. Like, again,
more
no
established
disrespect.
track record, right?
Right. Like, so we'll see. I mean, and I think for NC State, I think the question is funny because you started this by talking about where they're perceived by the media, and I think that's with question marks around Grayson McCall.
Right.
Like,
yeah, right. Exactly.
What if he's really good?
Right.
Where should they be perceived at that point? Right. I
Right.
think that's where it gets interesting for NC State.
I agree with that. I thought it was just interesting in general. I know last year the expectations around Brennan Armstrong because of the prior relationship with Robert and I that you mentioned, then it didn't work out, right? And then MJ Morris came in. They ended up going back to Armstrong. It was just kind of this flip-flop. MJ Morris 2 years ago was playing a decent bit as a true freshman, and I think a lot of people around the ACC were expecting, and I don't know if this is true within people who cover NC State day to day, but around the ACC, I think people were looking at MJ Morris like, all right, this guy's flashing. He's going to be pretty good in a few years, right? He's got good raw talent, athletic kid, and then he's kind of out the door, right? I mean, he decides he's going to transfer. It was like, okay, see you later. And Brennan Armstrong's back in the fold. That surprised me a little bit. So can you walk me through kind of the timeline in terms of like why MJ Morris made the decision that he did? And I know Dave Doran was out in the media like, yeah, he's not with the program anymore. It was just kind of from the outside, it just seemed very weird because it seemed like Morris was going to be the guy like year over year, like for multiple years coming. So it just seemed a little strange how that all went down at the end of last year.
Well, I think the unfortunate thing with MJ, the year you're referring to was that 2022, right? The first year he played.
Yeah. Yep.
So he was the number 3 guy going into the season, and he was a true freshman. And the thought going into the year was obviously Devin Leary was going to be NC State's guy. Was coming off a monster year. He got injured a month into the season, was out for the year. So then they brought in a transfer, Jack Chambers. It didn't work out. A G5 guy, kind of as a stopgap piece. So they turned it over to Morris. He took over midway through, I think, a Virginia Tech game. They won that game. Started the game against Wake Forest. Had a great game against Wake. They won that game. And then the home finale against Boston College, he didn't play well at all.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest, didn't play well. And State lost that game. I think they were double-digit favorite. Lost that game in the season finale against Boston College. And the unfortunate thing for MJ, he got banged up in that game. So he hurt his knee in that game. And so you really only had 2.5 starts or 2.5 opportunities to watch him play up and down. Didn't play against Louisville. Didn't play against North Carolina. Didn't play in the bowl game. Somehow he wasn't back. There's all kinds of speculation as to what was going on there. Did he just choose to not return? Some people say that. I don't know. But I think maybe him and the folks around him were expecting him to just be the guy in 23 based on what he did in those couple of games.
Right.
And you know this, if you're a program like NC State where you talked about it, you've won 8, 9, 10 games. Well, they haven't won 10 games, but they won 8 or 9 games the last 4 or 5 years. You feel like you're competing, and I don't think you think you're in a position where you can just hand the job to a guy who's made a start and a half, right? Like, or 2 starts. And so when you can go out and get Brennan Armstrong, you do it. And I think maybe that turned MJ and his family off a little bit because, Armstrong's not coming in to not start. So then he gets the job. He wins the job. He was better in spring practice, won the job, started the season. I think fans – it's funny. I had a buddy of mine tell me that he went to the season opener last year for NC State at UConn. And there were casual fans there who don't follow, like maybe aren't on our website or don't follow the day-to-day of the job, who were surprised MJ Morris wasn't the starter, right? Like they walk out and you don't see MJ Morris as a starter. It's like, what's going on, right? And so anytime the moment Armstrong didn't play well, there was this swell of fandom pumping up MJ wanting to see him. And that's where it led to, I think, him taking over. He wasn't good last year or this past year. He wasn't good. And then ultimately he decided to just save his red shirt. He set out the rest of the year. I that's an individual decision. Everybody can have their take on why you would do that. But the moment you make that decision, you know what that means. You're not coming back to NC State because you can't quit on a team like that and then think you're going to be the starter the next year. So he was out the door.
Joey and I talked about it on this podcast when it happened. It's like, well, he and whoever was assisting, right, in his decision, those around him, family, whoever, they had made that decision where collectively where they were like, look, we're not going to be here next year. Let's just let's save the red shirt. Let's save the eligibility. Let's have 3 years elsewhere. I am a Virginia Tech. I'm a Virginia Tech alum, James. So 2022 is my first. I know it was like a heart attack game for NC State, but I'm watching MJ Morris lead that second half comeback in Blacksburg, and I'm like, okay, he's great. He's going to be very good. He's going to be very good. So the whole quarterback shuffling thing, and I understand. I think you made a really good point where, like, Morris, 2.5 starts under his belt. This team feels like they're ready to compete now. Are you ready to hand the keys over to somebody who's highly touted, good prospect out of high school, relatively unproven, right? It's a double-edged sword, and with the transfer portal now, and that this is separate from the relationship that Armstrong had with Anai. You add that in, it was to me and Joey as well. We kind of shared the sentiment. Seemed like a no-brainer on paper in terms of, like, if you're going to go out and get a guy and you want Morris to continue learning, this is the situation. It's a quarterback on his final year of eligibility that you bring in who has a prior relationship with the OC that put up good numbers with that OC at UVA before Anai went to Syracuse, put up really good numbers with him. It made a lot of sense, but then the other side of it, of course, is like you mentioned, you know, it could have rubbed Morris the wrong way, and I think that's probably what happened.
And I mean, like, again, I don't blame him for saving a year of eligibility in the NIL era either, right? I mean, that's another year to get compensated through NIL, where if you're not a professional player, you want as many college years as possible with what they're compensating these players these days. So it makes sense on MJ's side. I just think NC State, you can't make that decision to turn it over to Morris. Now, if he would have played those 3 games he missed due to injury and he was really good, and like you know, you mentioned you're a VT alum, you guys probably feel like you've seen enough from Kyron Drones to say he's the guy, right? Like he made 6, 7, 8 starts to where you're comfortable with that. But 2 starts, and then one of them you lost to Boston College at home, who wasn't very good.
Right.
Like, no, I don't think we're ready to go that way. So
right. Made sense. And look, NC State lands Grayson McCall, and if he has a great year, nobody's going to be thinking about MJ Morris anymore. So, I mean, it's just that's the way it is right now in college football portal. Speaking of the portal, NC State brings in Jordan Waters at running back. And, I mean, good time for Duke to lose a head coach, right? You bring in a guy who's playing for a rival and a pretty damn good piece offensively to add in the fold in the backfield. I assume he's going to be the lead back, and who are the other guys who are going to play into the fold there in the running game for NC State?
Well, you know, in my opinion, last year NC State had probably, for as long back as I've been covering NC State, and I mean I started covering NC State in 2002, this was probably the worst running back room I've seen them have last year. Yeah. They were not very good at the running back position. I can read you their numbers last year. Do you know their leading rusher last year was Brendan Armstrong? He rushed for 660. He rushed for 660 yards last year. And then you had number 2 was Kevin Concepcion, their slot receiver.
Yep.
He rushed for 320 yards. So their leading rusher was Kendrick Raphael, true freshman, who rushed for 309 yards. And they still won 9 games last season, right? Like, and so now you look at it, and this is again where I speak to the upside we've been talking about with NC State is now you look at it, you're saying, okay, you go out and get Jordan Waters, who over the last 2 years in the ACC at Duke has scored 20 touchdowns and has rushed for 1,500 total yards. And like it completely changes the dynamic of their running game. And so, yeah, I think he's going to be the number 1 guy for certain. They've been raving about Jordan just as much as they have Grayson McCall. I think he's in line to have a big year. He came to NC State hoping for like a feature back role, right? Like his last couple of years at Duke, he's been splitting carries, but he's wanting that kind of bell cow role to where he can have a breakout year. And I think NC State's going to give him that, but they've got other guys in that room they like. You know, they went out and got Hollywood Smothers, who was a 4-star recruit out of high school, was at Oklahoma this past year, redshirted, transferred back to NC State as a redshirt freshman. Duke Scott, a true freshman they bring in, they love him. They're talking him up as well. But it starts with Jordan Waters. All conference last year at Duke. I mean, you go out and add an all conference running back. I mean, that's pretty good, right? I mean, that's a pretty good addition out of the portal.
It's a really good way to improve. What I agree was they made the most out of out of the run game, given what they knew they had by like mid-October. They were like, all right, listen, this is going to be, we're going to have to run the ball a lot with our quarterbacks. Like Casey is going to have to run the ball a bunch out the slot. There was a lot of jet sweep going on, a lot of that sort of thing. And I'm an advocate, and we're going to talk about the receiving room now. I mean, I'm an advocate for getting the ball in Concepcion's hands as much as you can, because he is electric with the ball. I think we saw that last year. He really burst onto the scene, and he's going to highlight this receiver room as a sophomore. He's going to highlight the room. I know NC State addressed the receiver room in the portal, because I know last year outside Concepcion they were searching for playmakers. So, you bring in a guy like Wesley Grimes, you bring in Noah Rogers. Talk about the players they're bringing in. I think the outlook is probably a little bit better in the receiving room, just because you're bringing in some guys who've kind of been around the block a little bit outside of Concepcion, or do you think it's still like kind of some question marks outside of him?
Well, at Inside Pack Sports, we cover recruiting, and like that's a big part of our website and the stuff we produce. Noah Rogers is the best high school receiver I've seen come out of North Carolina. And a little bit about his background. He was ranked 40th nationally in last year's class, the 2023 class.
Yep.
Overall, was like, I think, 7th receiver in the country. Went to Ohio State. The type of receivers Ohio State's bringing in, right? Like they're not bringing in. I mean, they have a pipeline of just guys that if we want you, you project to be an NFL receiver.
Yep.
He was the number 1 player in the state of North Carolina in the same class as Kevin Concepcion. Made the decision to pick Ohio State over NC State out of high school. Goes to Ohio State. They've got Marvin Harrison, Emeka Buka. He redshirted. That's just kind of the way they do things at Ohio State. You come in, you redshirt, or you play very, very little as a true freshman. But being able to add him back, like, I think the ceiling is extremely high for Noah Rogers. I think I would not be surprised if he's NC State's leading receiver this year. Now, again, not saying he will be their leading receiver, because KC had a monster season last year, but a lot of it was in my opinion, what you talked about, opportunity, right? Like NC State just didn't have the other options around him, and you've seen it during various seasons where guys pop up and have these great seasons because of what else is around them, right? Like you look at Virginia last year. Virginia's 2 receivers, they were funneled everything.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't throw the ball to anybody else. And so I'm not saying Malik Washington isn't great, but like he had the year he had because of opportunity. And so I think at NC State this year with Noah Rogers, Wesley Grimes, there's just going to be the target share is not going to be the same, I don't think, for KC. And so that's why I saw an interesting bet the other day that came out. Like there was odds out on who would lead the ACC in receiving this year. I think KC's probably been the consensus first team All ACC pick based on what he did last year, but I wouldn't be putting my money on him, even though I cover NC State. And that's not a knock on him. I still think he's going to be great.
Right. It's just a deeper room now.
Yeah, completely different dynamic. They're spreading targets around. Like it's not going to be the same, I don't think.
Yeah, that's a pretty good assessment, because I think a lot of the national people look at, and I mean, prior to this conversation I had with you, I look at NC State's offense. I'm like, they got Concepcion. He's going to put up 1,000 yards. It'll be fantastic. Not to say he still won't do that. He still could do that, right? But the target share is going to be spread out, I think, this year in a way that it wasn't last year, especially with – I think they're going to have more of a commitment to try to run the ball with Jordan Waters, too, and I think that'll change Concepcion's outlook a little bit, too, in the running game. Tight ends, veterans, comfortable there, it seems like, more so than the receiving core.
I mean, another addition they made, again, we've talked about it, man. They crushed it. I mean, Virginia Tech, like I know you guys cover them. I thought they did an outstanding job in the portal, right? Like especially on the defensive side. NC State, like they placed a heavy emphasis on the offense in the portal, and one of the guys they added was Justin Jolie, a transfer from UConn, who I think last year he was 2nd in the country in receptions among tight ends as a true sophomore. Had 56 catches last year. I believe the only guy he trailed was Brock Bowers. Led the country in missed tackles for us really good player. Led the country in missed tackles for us at the tight end position. He played against NC State. I mean, he went and played at Tennessee, had 8 catches for 89 yards in that game. He's an instant upgrade for them in the tight end room. Like they've been raving about him as well. He's another guy who is going to eat into that target share in terms of how NC State uses him. Like I think he's going to be another piece they're gonna lean on. I mean, they went out and added a bunch of different guys because those rooms were bare. I mean, it was basically last year run Brendan Armstrong or try and get the ball in Kevin Concepcion's hands, and I think they wanted to address that in the portal, and they did that.
Offensive line, I know it's a little bit reworked. There are some guys coming back, but they had Zeke Correll from Notre Dame, which if you're adding a Notre Dame offensive lineman into the room, that's generally a pretty good thing. They churn a lot of those guys out. I would say probably more so tackles than guards, but they do a pretty good job of developing offensive linemen. So if you're bringing in a Notre Dame offensive lineman, you have to feel pretty good about that. And I think the one question I have for you too, and it ties into the offensive line. I know Robert Anae's offense is like dating back to like his time at UVA. The rushing numbers have kind of been up and down, and I know he's still relatively new to NC State. But is there concern? I mean, I guess coming off of last year not being able to run the ball with the running backs, given his track record, is there concern with him as an OC? With his, I guess, spotty track record with his teams being able to run the ball? Or do you think this was a matter of personnel should be upgraded this year with the offensive line should be a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it was personnel.
Yeah.
I mean, the year before he was at Syracuse and Sean Tucker had 1,100 yards and 11 touchdowns rushing the football
Right.
at Syracuse. I mean,
Right.
they're not a great running team. I mean, but Sean Tucker's was a really good back.
Yeah, for sure.
I just think NC State's room wasn't good. Their top two running backs transferred out. One ended up at Marshall, the other ended up at UNLV, and then their third guy that left ended up at Eastern Michigan.
G5,
so right, like I mean, that's the type of room you had, and now you're getting Waters, you're getting Smothers, who was a consensus 4-star recruit. I think they feel like they've just upgraded the position there. O-line wise, though, you add in Zeke. They did have a question mark at center. Dylan McMahon was a 3rd-round draft pick. He graduated, moved on. Right, so now you add in Zeke Correll into that spot. And I think that was kind of the selling point for Zeke when he went to portal. I mean, State's last two of their last 3 centers, you had Garrett Bradbury, who won the Remington, and then you had Dylan McMahon. And so I think Correll fits that in. And then they returned their other 4 starters. They returned their left tackle in Anthony Belton, right tackle Jacarius Peak, Tim McCase. They've got 4 returning starters up front they feel good about. Adding Correll, I think they think the O-line is going to be a strength. Man, when I look at NC State, and we haven't talked about the defense yet, but for me, it's kind of odd I'm saying this because they've been so strong defensively. I have more concerns with their defense than their offense this year. Like, I think they're going to score points.
Yeah, I agree. And looking at the defensive line now, I mean, it's huge that Davin Van turned down the NFL. I know he's got professional aspirations, so he's back, and that's great. But I know you're losing some guys in that room up front that have been serious contributors. Savion Jackson leaving is tough, right? But you got a room that has some unproven guys, right? So I mean, just give us an idea of what this room looks like, concern level. Is this the one area of the team where there's most concern, or should we look somewhere else on the defense?
I personally would look at linebacker.
Yeah.
I don't know if you went to the Virginia Tech game against NC State last year, or I know you probably watched it, but Peyton Wilson was a wrecking ball.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I think it felt like he had 10 tackles in the first quarter when the game was basically over at that point, right? And so, he Bednarik Award winner, best defensive player in college football. You replace him, and like, that room has lost a lot. And we'll talk about the linebackers, but on the D line, I think Davin Van, you got him back. They really like him, obviously. Brandon Cleveland's a player they love at defensive, at nose guard. They have a 3-man front, odd front.
Yep.
So at nose, they've got Brandon Cleveland. And I think him returning led to C.J. Clark, their starter, going to Miami. I think State was turning that position over to Cleveland this year. And CJ made the decision to go into the portal. He ends up in Miami. I don't know if he's starting there or not, but he has started for NC State last year as a kind of an upperclassman. But Cleveland he's too good. Like, he's just too good to not be the guy. And so I think State was turning that position over to him. And then that other side, you're going to see a mix of Red Hibbler, Trevally Price, Noah Potter, all good players, looking to replace Savion. But where you're going to miss from Savion, I mean, is his physicality in the run game. I mean, NC State's been one of the top rush defenses in the country.
Yep.
And it's because of a guy like him just setting the edge and being physical. Like, he's not getting a lot of tackles or sacks or different things like that. But just the way he played to the scheme, I think is going to be tough to replicate.
You lose Jackson, and then of course Peyton Wilson, who just as a player, just individually, is probably his single biggest loss in the entire ACC, just because of what kind of player he was. So you lose those two types of players, and I can understand why there would be concern about the rush defense a little bit, just because those are two difference makers there. Linebacking core, it's impossible to replace Peyton Wilson, right? Just singularly, he's just he was so outstanding. But it's going to be a collective effort. So the linebacking core, you mentioned it as a concern, but who are some guys who you think can contribute to at least give you maybe 70% of what Wilson provided? Because I think, Pack fans would take that given everything that Wilson provided over his long career.
Let's take a quick second to remind you about Section103.com. It is the internet's premier place for all things wonderful Georgia Tech apparel. They've got t-shirts, they've got sweatshirts, they've got hoodies, they've got a short sleeve coach hoodie if you want to look like Coach Key. They've got onesies for babies. They've got all things for any man, woman, children, something for the whole family. All the Georgia Tech fans in your life, they need something from Section103.com. Use promo code GOACC for 10% off your first order. You can go get t-shirts supporting NIL efforts with guys like Haynes King and Zach Pyron. They've got shirts supporting the basketball team, the baseball team, the volleyball team, all sorts of wonderful Tech traditions, all sorts of things. Again, any Georgia Tech fan in your life, they need something from Section103.com. Once again, use promo code GOACC for 10% off your first order. I particularly love the Feliz Bobby Dodd sweatshirts. We got Christmas season coming up before you know it. You're going to want one of those for your holiday party. Go get it all at Section103.com. Huge shout out to Steven and the gang. Thank you so much to them for their support of the Basketball Conference podcast. We would love it if you guys would go show your support for Section103.com as well. Now, back to the episode.
Yeah, one of the moves they made in the offseason, they moved Sean Brown from safety to that will linebacker spot. And that's a guy who they have high hopes for this year. Different body type than Peyton, but same physicality, same style of play. But for me with Sean, it's just going to be one of those deals where, I'm going to wait and see, right? Because positioning from, like he played, I know in the Clemson game, Peyton got dinged up and was knocked out, I believe, the second half of that game. And so they slid Sean down to that position in that game against Clemson, and he played really well. He played really well in that game, and I think that gave State some hope moving forward that they could put him there. But playing will linebacker in a 3-3 odd man front scheme one game or one half is a lot different than doing it over the course of 12 games, right? But, I mean, again, he had 11 tackles in that game against Clemson. So they think there's a lot of hope there that Brown can be a star. I just want to be able to see it week to week to week before I say that's going to happen, right? I mean, so until that happens, it's a concern. But I think they feel like he can play there. They bring back Devon Betty, who started in the middle for him last year. Caden Fordham's another guy. So they've got some experience. I just think when you look at State's defense over the last 3 years, Drake Thomas was two-time All-ACC. Yeah. Isaiah Moore was all-conference. You had three linebackers who were all multi-year all-conference players. Now they're all gone, and so you just expect there to be some drop-off.
Right.
Unless Tony Gibson's just sprinkling fairy dust on guys in that room. And maybe he is. I don't know. He could be. We'll find – this is going to be the test. If you sit here and we're sitting here in December and Sean Brown's All-ACC, we're like, damn it, Tony, okay, you're the guy.
You did it again. Yeah,
you did it again. You got us again. Yeah.
Here's your pay raise.
Right.
Here's your pay raise. Secondary, they bring in transfers at safety. I know Jihad Carr is coming in from Syracuse, very productive player over the course of his career. Aiden White, best year of his career last year, third-team All-ACC. He's back, so that's great. You lose Shaheem Battle. You mentioned the move of Sean Brown to linebacker. I think the outlook in the secondary is pretty good just because I know there's experience there.
Yeah, I mean, Jihad Carter, you mentioned at nickel. They love him. He was at Syracuse, went to Ohio State. He's at NC State now. They added in KJ Martin, a transfer from Akron, was all-conference at Akron. Devon Marshall was all-conference at Villanova. So they went out and got 3 transfer portal additions. DK Kaufman from Auburn was another guy they brought in. So they really wanted to add experience in those rooms just because I think, again, like we talked about at the quarterback position, why rebuild? right? Like with this transfer portal era, you like it's almost become a deal where if I'm a freshman going to college, I better show what I can do. Because I don't feel like there's a need for a college to just hand anything to a freshman or a young guy anymore. Right? You know, we can just go out and get somebody in the portal. And so State did that. I mean, Aiden White's the big name for them. I mean, he hasn't allowed a touchdown in 2 years at corner, which is, I think, unbelievable stat. You know, he was first team all conference 2 years ago, was third team this past year. He's just been really good. And he went in the portal. I think State was worried they were going to lose him. He was in there for about a week and just came back out and was able to stay in Raleigh. But, yeah, I mean, they love their secondary, man. There's no questions at all there. I think that's probably up there, in my opinion. If you're ranking the rooms at NC State, it's probably top 3 or 4 overall.
Yeah.
You know, I think they feel like that's going to be a strength for them defensively.
Braden, so I usually it kind of depends on the team. Talking about special teams, I feel like when you lose a Groza award-winning kicker, you kind of have to talk about special teams a little bit. I mean, is NC State feeling pretty good about the addition of Braden Narveson out of the portal, bringing him from Western Kentucky? Do they feel pretty good about that? I mean, how's the outlook on the kicking game looking? Because when you lose a Groza award winner, you got to talk about it.
Well, I mean, I think you never know on kicking, right? I mean, it's one of those deals. I mean, NC State fans, they'll never forget. Well, I think it was 2017. You know, you're shaking your head, the Clemson kick, where you had the game won and you missed a 33-yarder. It's like I can't watch an NFL game now where they moved the extra point back to 33 yards in the NFL. It's like every time they say a 33-yard extra point, I'm like, yeah. Every time that game comes up. But you're right. I mean, I think you don't know about kicking until you get out there.
Yeah.
And you see it. And there's been years, I'm sure you've noticed probably following your teams, where you don't know at that position until you see it. And so I think that's kind of where State's at with kicking. I mean, I think the hope is every year we're kicking a lot of extra points, right? Like, let's not have to kick field goals.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm actually of the opinion, I know with NC State, and maybe it's because I think Doran, I don't want to say he's conservative to a fault, but they've been really good defensively. Like, I'm of the opinion sometimes I'd almost prefer to not have a good kicker because then you just go for it more, right? Like, you know, you're not kicking as many field goals. I've seen a lot of 4th and 3, 41-yard field goal kicks. Like, just go for it. Yeah. So we'll see. Maybe it plays out that way for NC State this year.
Maybe robbing Peter to pay Paul a little bit of, you know, it
right.
has, you know, Doran ends up being a little bit more aggressive in moments where you're sitting there like, oh my God, please. It's 4th and a yard. They're back.
And you're kicking a 39-yard field goal with your defense. And there's multiple ways you can look at it. You get it, right? Like, I always look at it and say, well, damn, if my defense is so good, they can get us out of a hole. I don't have to worry about protecting them, right?
Well, yeah, and of course it's situational too, right? I mean, you can lean on your defense, right? If it's 4th and goal from the 3, and your option is to go for it, and you know you have the opportunity to score a touchdown, or you pin them, worst case scenario, with your excellent defense, and they're at the 3-yard line. You force a 3 and out, you get the ball back in plus territory again. There's only so many, and again, depends on situation. If it's end of half or something like that, maybe take the points. But I mean, you have the opportunity there to pin a team back. You do it. I don't know. I'm all for aggression as well.
And that's why I say you don't win a Groza award if your kicker's kicking extra points.
Right, that's right. So maybe less Groza award winning and more, you know, KC Concepcion all ACCs and stuff like that.
There you go.
Fair. Let's take a look at the schedule. So NC State goes 9-4 last year. They were 6-2 in the ACC. They finished 3rd in the conference. Very good team. Return a lot. Add Grayson McCall. We just talked about the concerns maybe up front on defense and a little bit in the linebacking core. I think that's all fair. I look at this schedule and I understand why people are high on NC State for a couple of different reasons. Number one, the team itself, which we just went through at length. Number two, I think this schedule is pretty favorable. But the one thing I want to mention that I think is a little bit of a quirk that I have not seen with the other previews I've done so far this summer is NC State does not have a bye week until October 26th. And that is the first time I've seen that. Most teams I've previewed so far in the ACC have had both a September bye and either a late October or early November bye. The fact that NC State needs to play 3, 6, 8 games consecutively they're the only team in the conference I've seen that has to do that. And I have a few more teams to preview, and I'll look at their schedules more in detail. They may be the only team in the ACC that has 8 straight games before getting 2 byes in the final 6 weeks. So I just want to hone in on that scheduling quirk itself for a minute. And, there are a lot of winnable games in there, which is great. But the inevitable grind of the season, I feel like having 8 straight games, that really, really makes it tough, even with a team as talented as NC State has on paper.
Oh, I agree. I think in my opinion, probably the counter to that for NC State would be their 2 biggest games during the first month of the season.
Agree.
Right? When you look at Clemson, you look at Tennessee week 2, Clemson week 4, to where if those games were week 6 and 8, right, for instance, or 7 and 8, where you're late in that stretch,
right,
you feel a little worse about it, right? And
right.
so I think once you get past Clemson, you can make a legitimate argument that they're favored in every game remaining on their schedule as of today.
Yeah,
as of today.
Right.
And that's where the optimism for NC State comes from. But you're right. I mean, it's going to be a grueling season, and that's why I think you're going to see NC State try and do a lot what they did last year, where if you look at that final stretch of the year last year for NC State, Miami, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, North Carolina, I mean, man, they probably led 95% of those games from start to finish.
Yep.
And they just got out front on teams, ran the clock out, shortened the game, didn't try to do a ton offensively. And I think maybe they look at that as a way to try and stay healthy to get to those byes. Because, it's going to be – I think after you get past Clemson, and there's this stat going around, like what happens after the week after Clemson because of how physical they are. For NC State, you've probably seen it, right? But for NC State, you got to follow that up with they do get NIU or Northern Illinois the week after, but then you got to follow it up with 4 straight games before a bye or 5 straight games. So, it's not going to be easy, but I do think they okay, well, Tennessee and Clemson, we got them the first month of the season. Theoretically, you should be your healthiest around them, and you want to be healthy in those games.
I think that's a fair way to look at it, and that's the way, I think that's the flip side of, it's a grind to go through 8 in a row to start the year. The flip side of it is two of your toughest opponents on the entire schedule are in the first 4 games. Mm-hmm. And so I look at this, and I think the point you made about shortening the game, running out the clock, I think is a good one, because I think the Western Carolina game in the opener, get ahead, sit everybody. Don't show too much. Don't show too much for Tennessee. Sit everybody. Tennessee's got a lot of hype. Nico, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name.
There you go.
Stud quarterback, right? They have a lot of hype around them. That game is going to be really exciting there in week 2. But I think NC State's got to get a lot of games here where they get a lead. I mean, you look at Louisiana Tech, you look at Northern Illinois, Wake Forest, I think is going to be pretty bad. Syracuse and Cal, I think, are going to be. We'll see. But NC State's going to be favored in all these games, not named Tennessee or Clemson. And if they're not favored in either of those games, they're probably going to be a relatively short underdog, I would assume. So, I mean, this is a situation here in the first 8 weeks where I think if you're NC State and we're talking like projecting the ceiling of this team, right? Mm-hmm. And I think ceiling would obviously be, okay, make an ACC title game, ideally with 1 loss, look good against whoever you're playing in the ACC title. If you're going to lose, right? Look good against whoever you're playing in the ACC title game, or just flat out win the game. You're in the playoff. But if you go through the season 10-2, and one of those losses is the ACC title game, we'll see how it all shakes out. But I feel like a situation where I guess that would be 11-2. You'd have 11 wins. You'd be 11-1 going into the ACC title game. You would lose that game. An 11-win NC State, I feel like, should be in the college football playoff in that scenario, right? And that would require splitting Tennessee and Clemson and winning everything else and getting to the title game with 1 loss. I think that would be the ideal scenario. How realistic it is, well, they're going to be favored in a lot of these games, James, but my thought on it is there could be an inevitable slip up because you're playing 8 games in a row, right? Outside of Tennessee and Clemson, you get into a body blow game against a team like Syracuse that's going to run the ball a ton. You get into a body blow game. You got to go cross country on the road at Cal and face a good Justin Wilcox defense with an offense that should be improved. Not as good as NC State, but should be obviously a little bit improved. Is there a game in there that NC State could drop in the first 8? But then towards the end of the year, you got Stanford at home. They have to travel across the country. You have Duke. I know I know Duke's won 3 of the last 4, so we don't want to overlook Duke.
Yeah.
But year 1, Manny Diaz. End of the year, Georgia Tech on the road on a Thursday night. Georgia Tech, I think, will be pretty decent, but they got a grueling schedule by that point in November. How healthy are they? At UNC. I feel like there's a third loss. I'm going to go 9-3. I think depending on how it shakes out, that could be, because depending on who the losses are, that could be good enough to get into the ACC title game. 9-3, maybe 2 conference losses. I think you can probably get into the conference title game with two losses. We'll see about Miami and Florida State and Clemson. They all have questions. I'm going to go 9-3. I think it's a really good year for NC State. I think they have a chance to get in the ACC title game, make some noise.
Well, I think their schedule to me is favorable in a couple of different ways. For one, I was looking at the preseason poll. They were picked 4th in the preseason poll, had 8 first-place votes.
Yep.
Of the top, and I think for me, I don't know how you did your preseason poll, but for me, once you got to 7, I thought there was a cutoff, right? Like once you got through
I think
maybe
so.
SMU, you start getting into North Carolina, Georgia Tech. Those teams, a little more question marks for me.
Right. Yep.
NC State's the only one of those teams that plays only one of the top 7, and they only get Clemson.
Yep.
So they don't play Florida State, Miami, Louisville, Virginia Tech, or SMU. They don't play any of those guys.
Yep.
Only get Clemson, and it's with their first ACC game of the year, I believe. And so, if they win that game,
driver's seat.
Like the position they're in, right? I mean, the position they're in is because these other teams are going to be, I think, kind of knocking each other off.
I agree,
and it gives them room. It gives them room, kind of to what you're saying, to have a kind of a WTF loss, or however you want to label it, right? Just kind of an out of nowhere loss,
right?
It gives you room for that, and you're still 7-1. I think the path for NC State, I feel like Virginia Tech's kind of similar too. I think the path for those two teams this year is similar to what we saw last year with Louisville, where it was just kind of like their schedule. Louisville's schedule wasn't great, but they won the 1 or 2 games that were questionable early on, and then they got to the end of the year, and it didn't even matter. They lost to Miami. They still were going to the title game.
Right.
I mean, and I think that's where you're at with NC State. And the other thing I want to say about their schedule, with the 2 games being front-loaded, you're talking about getting into the top 12, where they're ranked right now.
Right.
Having those games early, like, it allows you to overcome some things from a ranking standpoint.
Totally agree.
Right, like, because it's different if you're having those games late in the year and you stumble and lose. Whereas you see a team like an NC State maybe really gain momentum down the stretch because they are stacking wins, and so I think that gives them maybe a little more upside to slide into the top 12 at the end of the year because of how their schedule sets up. What's going to be fascinating to me with the league this year, man, is I feel like there's going to be some ties somewhere to will a team not make the title game and finish ranked higher because of it, right? Like if you have 3 teams 7-1, well, one of those teams isn't going, but they're also not adding a loss. Yeah, and so how do you handle that?
And it's the question that we've had. It's the question we've had with when it was a 4-team playoff. It's a question everybody had. Mm-hmm. It came up a lot with Notre Dame. It was like, okay, how do you penalize teams that are playing an extra game? You lost in a conference title game, but you were there. You were there. So you were there in a way that another team wasn't. So now you're going to penalize a team for making a conference title game and losing? It's kind of
the other team saying. And the other team saying it's a random tiebreaker that we're not there, right? Like, so.
Right.
And how do you handle that?
And then that team's also talking about, well, it's also, look how that team just lost, right? So if they go in and they get blown out, it's like, okay, well, if we were there and we lost on a random tiebreaker, if we were there, maybe we don't lose by 17, maybe we lose by 10, and it's a lot more competitive game. So those are kind of that's the nature of the narratives of the argument. I think the thing that you mentioned, the driver's seat thing, if they beat Clemson, they're going to be favored in every ACC game the rest of the way, right? I mean, they're going to be favored in the rest of the games. At least as we sit here recording in mid-August, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be. And that's a really good spot to be in because, I mean, you mentioned Virginia Tech, who's in a similar situation. The difference with Virginia Tech is they play Miami and Clemson, right? So now you got to split against 2 teams in conference, whereas if NC State splits against their 2 toughest teams, one of them's out of conference. So that's a better spot to be in. I'd rather have a tough out-of-conference opponent, and Tech's got one, and we'll see Rutgers' quarterback situation, but Rutgers up front is going to be a little bit dicey. I like NC State a lot. I think I think I'm just going to say 9-3. I'm going to build in a second ACC loss, and say they. But I mean, that would require me saying they probably drop both against Tennessee and Clemson, which I mean they very well could, but they also may not. Tennessee's got some questions. You could split them, and then you're in the 1-loss situation, either with the conference loss or without one. So I could very easily see 10-2.
I could see NC State. I could see NC State, Virginia Tech, and Florida State, for instance, all being 7-1.
Yeah.
And if that happens, one of those teams isn't going to the title game.
I know.
Are they not deserving of the top 12 because of some random tiebreaker based on it? It's something that I think is going to be interesting because of the way they've shaken up the league scheduling now.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anybody's going undefeated in the league. I don't think the team's strong enough.
I don't think so either.
You know, and I mean, like you're mentioning NC State, for instance. I mean, Clemson's 14, Tennessee's 15, State's 22 in the poll, so they're all kind of right there. I mean, it's not like they can't split those games. Now, I think ideally, if you're State, it's Clemson, you're winning. But even if it's Tennessee, if you got a Tennessee win under your belt, you lose to Clemson and say you went out. That's a pretty good non-conference win to have when you're debating where you are in the top 12.
Well, I agree, and the story will be out. I wrote something for Sports Illustrated that hasn't been published yet. It'll be published by the time people listen to this podcast. It was takeaways from the top 25, and one of them was that I think the ACC has a chance to be potentially the second deepest league in college football this year. I mean, you talk about the 4 teams that are ranked, but then, you know, Virginia Tech's not ranked, and they're looming. SMU's looming. There are some teams that are – Louisville is looming. There are some teams that are sitting right outside the top 25 that, I mean, to the point where at the end of September, the ACC could end up having 6 or 7 teams ranked. So this is going to be a very, very deep league this year, and I think folks see the contenders in the ACC, and I think it's fair, see the contenders in the ACC as a half step or a full step behind, like Ohio State or you know, Oregon, or I mean, name that team, Georgia, at the top of the poll, which is fine. But I think as far as depth in the ACC is concerned and the ability to get multiple teams in, I think the ACC does have a very good chance of being a multi-bid league in the first year of the college football playoff, the 12 team.
I agree. I don't know why the Big Ten would be ranked higher than the ACC, but that could be a discussion for others. I'm not a Big Ten fan in terms of their league, but I do think obviously we know what the SEC has, but when you look at the Big Ten, go look at Ohio State's schedule. Tell me how tough it looks.
Right.
I don't know if you've looked at it, but go look at it and see. You know, I mean, now if they go undefeated, they'll probably get a pass and get in, but
it's a 1-game season.
Yeah. So, but man, I think the league is wide open. You know, I know NC State's excited about what they have, but a lot of teams should be. You know, like I'm a big Virginia Tech fan. When we did our preview of them in terms of the upcoming season, like that was one of our dark horse teams for me, just kind of similar to NC State schedule. Yeah. I mean, it really comes down a lot of times to who you play and who you don't. I know folks don't want to hear that, but it does.
And the thing too is like the depth of the roster, I think, is improving for Pry. It's not there yet. But he's done I mean, you mentioned in passing the portal earlier. He's just done a really good job in the portal. And Virginia Tech's biggest issue last year, I think, was defensively in the trenches, interior defensive line. Inside linebacker was very bad. They really struggled at Mike linebacker, and they addressed those in the portal. And I think given the schedule, how the team performed against teams it should beat, right, last year, and I get that there were teams that they shouldn't beat, and they lost those games, NC State, Louisville, Florida State, basically after the month of September, they lost those games. But you also just take a look at the schedule, and there's just not a lot of those types of teams. So I think Virginia Tech has a chance to make noise as well. James, really appreciate it, man. A lot of fun. Appreciate you coming on. We'll definitely have you on again. Want to give you an opportunity to plug everything you got going over at Inside Pack Sports.
Yeah, I started Inside Pack Sports in 2017, so we've been going now for 8 years. Cover daily. We cover NC State athletics, all sports, recruiting. We do a lot on the video side, the audio side as well. We've got several podcast platforms that you can check out. But yeah, check us out, InsidePackSports.com. I am on Twitter at InsidePackSport. So appreciate it.
Yeah, but we'll definitely have you on again. Appreciate it, James.
Yeah, definitely, Mike. Thanks.
All right, so we'll be back. That's the NC State preview with James Henderson. Go check out Inside Pack Sports. Really enjoyed the conversation with him. We'll be back. Check us out on social media at BC Podcast ACC, youtube.com/at the ACC Football Podcast. Go subscribe. Trying to get the video element of this podcast rolling here again this year. We'll be back soon. More ACC previews, full conference wide preview to come, obviously, next week ahead of week 0. Until next time, go ACC.